you can have a show that becomes extremely popular. So it's great. It starts to gain, it has production or not. It starts organically, but it becomes very popular. Okay. But that's one bucket. It's the bucket probably every creator dreams, like, okay, my podcast becomes the next Joe Rogan, just to give an example. Okay, that's one bucket. But then I think that the possibility of being long-lasting and have a trustworthy audience is catering to a niche, to a specific group of people, which is not too broad.
Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv. I made a lot of really good friends at the podcast show in London, and one of them I was so pleased to meet, Alberto Betella of RSS.com. Alberto, how are you? And thank you for speaking with me today.
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure, and it was a pleasure meeting you at the podcast show.
As it was yourself. Yes, so we had a really good long conversation at the Castle pub in Islington, where there was a get-together for the podcast show. So there was myself, there was yourself, John McDermott, Andrea Cascai, and our mutual friend Sam Sethi. Lovely guy. Everybody loves Sam. And we were just talking about what's going on in the industry with podcasting 2.0. And we thought it'd be a good idea to expand on that in a discussion on the show.
Correct. It was serendipitous. It was great meeting there. Everyone loves Sam, as you say. It's correct. And he's a great connector. So I'm very glad we had the chance to speak. And now we can follow up with this conversation today.
Absolutely. The first thing that I noticed in your history was the superb podcast generator, which was 2005, I believe.
Correct. So the story of my company today, RSS.com, is actually grounded in an earlier tool for podcasters. And the story is I find it pretty nice. I may be biased, but the story starts in early years of podcasting. In the US, Libsyn had recently launched in those years. So podcast hosting was still in the and, the medium was still being defined. And what happened on the other side of the pond in Europe, right?
Yeah.
I was born and raised in Italy, and my undergraduate was in Italy in a university in the north called Bergamo. And at that university, there was a professor who had an idea. He discovered podcasting and said, we should do a university podcast. So I was his student. And again, this was December 2005.
Yes.
I said, what's a podcast? And when I realized what it was, I volunteered to build a tool that would make it easier to generate the RSS feed of a podcast. For anyone working in education, I was thinking about teachers, educators, people who may be technical, but also may not be so technical. So I thought, I'm going to take care of this. It's going to be my final project for my degree there in Bergamo. A literature degree, by the way. It's nothing to do with technology at the time. So that's how it started. And I developed the first version, very simple, very basic, and launched it in April 2006. So while in the US, podcast hosting, in the sense of commercial podcast hosting, was launched 1 or 2 years before, there was this small project in the heart of Europe for a small university in northern Italy. But once I launched it, because it was open source and at the time was on a platform called SourceForge, which is still there, but at the time was the main platform where you would download free and open source software. Because of that, it started to gain visibility very soon. So I started to see users from universities in the US, in many countries in Europe, and literally all over the world. I could see these installations of podcast generator popping up. Yes, I called it podcast generator.
Yeah.
I can go on for 3 hours with the story. So if you have any questions specifically, you tell me how to.
Okay.
It's such a long story. 20 years basically. This year it was the 20th anniversary.
Yes. SourceForge, I know a lot about because my stepfather developed a relay software. Because when Linux came out originally, they were having some issues with relays on their programming. So my stepfather and his then partner in a company called Ryganon, they created this relay that made it work easier. And then they made that originally open source through SourceForge. And then they were contacted by Linux, who bought out that relay so that it could become part of the main software. So I know that from my own experience about that site.
I think this is a great story, and a takeaway about that story, and perhaps our story too as a company, is that open source, free software, but also passion projects can eventually monetize. And this is the case. Podcast Generator was launched in 2006. I then left. I moved countries, still in Europe. I went to Spain. I did a master's degree. Then I did a PhD. The bigger field was technology. And yeah, so I kept maintaining that project over the years. I maintained it for 13 years, initially on SourceForge. Then I switched to GitHub. And I maintained it because people were using it. We know of at least 25,000 podcasts that used it and 500,000 downloads. It's difficult to have the exact data because there was no tracking mechanisms in a podcast generator. And it was deliberate. It was privacy first. You install it. So the only way I could see the installations was Googling basically the footer, text powered by podcast generator, etc., etc. But we did power over 25,000 podcasts, many of which were academic. There were a lot of churches as well, what we call today Godcasting. There were creators who at the time owned a simple hosting space anywhere, and we're able to install Podcast Generator. One anecdote I would like to talk about is that the installation requirements of Podcast Generator, they were minimal. Yeah. At the University of Bergamo, to develop this, I was given a hosting space with only PHP, Linux and PHP, but no database.
Yes.
So there was no MySQL, there was no database in general. So I relied on text files. Basically, when you uploaded an episode, I would have a text file corresponding to the episode with the metadata, title, description. And that was very basic. And in my announcement in April 2006, the first thing I wrote, and it's still there on SourceForge, that announcement said, I'm going to add MySQL soon. We are missing a database. I never ended up adding the database because it turns out that having minimum requirements without having to set up a database for the user segment of Podcast Generator, a professor, a church, it made it easier to install. It would be just a folder you would download from SourceForge. You would unzip in your web hosting space, and then with your browser, you would go to that URL, to that address, and you would just follow the setup. You would put the title of the podcast, a description, your user and password, and that's it. No database. And I guess the takeaway of building something open source and maintaining it as a passion project for over a decade is that in some cases, it can convert into something bigger. It can become even your job. And that's what happened with RSS.com.
Absolutely. But not getting past the podcast generator for the time being, it was innovative in the fact that it made publishing your podcast a lot easier. So a lot of these people now that do podcast, it would have been really difficult for them because they don't do the tech side. It's a bit like when Claire Waite Brown talks about podcasting 2.0 and she's simplifying it for people. It's because of this with Podcast Generator. That's the beginning of making the whole world of podcasting easier, that you didn't need to have all that programming, because I had experience trying to do that with website design with PHP, trying to put sound on there and music on there and these things. It was not easy without having Podcast Generator initially, and then everything has stemmed from there.
I agree that the problem that Podcast Generator solved for a decade, and especially in those early years, as one of the early podcasting tools or podcast publishing and distribution tools at the time, self-hosted, it was that it saved you time in understanding the technicalities of podcasting. Now, if you are technical, it's not so hard per se.
No.
You need to put an audio or a video file. Video was supported by Podcast Generator. Video has always been supported as a single download file, not as HLS like now. But video has been there since early years. So you would upload a media file somewhere online in a web space, but then you needed to create and update the so-called RSS feed. Yep. The RSS feed is what makes podcasting what it is today. It made it because it was open, because any application, directory, platform could use it to ingest podcast episodes. So this is what defines podcasting at the core. The point with the RSS feed is that it's not even programming, technically speaking. It can be considered programming, but truly, it's a semantic language. It's based on XML, extensive markup language. It's markup. So you basically say, open the channel. The channel is the podcast. How is it called? It's called My Podcast. Open the item. The item is the episode. What the item title is. The title is My First Episode, etc. So open title, close title, open description, close description. And then there was this tag that made a podcasting what it was, which is called enclosure.
Yes.
The enclosure tag per se consists of a URL, which is the URL of the episode. And any application that reads this RSS feed looks at the episodes, at the items, and for each episode is going to look into the enclosure tag and download the media file. So it's not so hard per se, but can you imagine a teacher or someone who's starting podcasting having to deal with manually editing that RSS feed? That was the whole point. Even myself, I have no problem editing an RSS feed. But if you make a mistake, you forget to close a tag, you put a character that's not valid, you literally block the distribution, you break the podcast. So it's much easier to automate it. And that was the mission of Podcast Generator, which was very simple. It was creating a podcast and uploading a new episode as if it was an email attachment. You drag and drop, you browse it from your local machine, and it takes care of all the technicalities under the hood.
It made it so much easier to do that. Then you went from being downloadable and it became browser-based from there. And after that, the story goes that Benjamin bought the domain for rss.com in the mid-2010s, was it?
It was 2013. So I was still doing my PhD in Barcelona. Ben was in another continent, and he bought this domain rss.com. The RSS feeds that were also included and part of social networks like Facebook, they started to fade away in social networks because those platforms wanted to engage more with the users. They wanted stickiness to then be able to advertise. So instead of a natural, organic presentation of content, which also was very well coupled with RSS feeds, those platforms wanted algorithms. So if you like, I don't know, singing cats, I show you that. If you like watching funny jokes, then I show you funny jokes. And that's what's made social networks so powerful, social media so powerful, and also so dangerous. If you think about the conversations today with, teenagers and using these kind of platforms and how everything is biased, can be biased. Long story short, the RSS feed started to lose protagonism in some applications. At the same time, Google had closed their RSS reader, which I was a big user of. I had a lot of blogs that I was following. So Ben thought he would get the domain and build an RSS reader. And that's what he did. So that's how he started. We didn't know each other. He bought it. I was in Barcelona at the time doing my PhD. And Ben built this RSS reader using the domain rss.com. And you fast forward 2017, July 2017.
Okay.
And I received an email. In July 2017, Podcast Generator was still surfing the wave of self-hosting podcasts. It was still active. It still had tens of thousands of users, active users. So Ben found it. Ben was looking for something open source to embed in his website. The reason being that people were writing to Ben asking, do you support podcasts? And after a few of those support tickets, requests, he thought maybe I should support podcasts. And that's how we met. We reached out, sent an email. And I remember the email very clearly because it was in English, Italian, and Spanish. So we speak the same languages.
Okay.
And it was a very short but nice email. And that's when we engaged for the first time. My first answer was, do you own a 3letter.com domain called rss.com? And he said, yes, I do. I said, wow, this is great. Let's talk. So that's how we met.
That first email, was that the first interaction you had with Ben? That must have been very strange to get an email from out of nowhere from somebody.
Let me give more context. It was not so strange because, again, Podcast Generator in its niche was pretty popular. Meaning there was a website which is podcastgenerator.net. And this website, by the way, today, this year, changed. And we are telling the whole 20 years anniversary story of this product. And we closed it officially because it evolved, it did its job. So podcastgenerator.net was a very popular website and had great SEO indirectly because it was one of the few tools for self-hosting of a podcast, and it was free. So
yes,
I used, and again, I'm telling this with the humility, I received emails pretty often about Podcast Generator. On top of that, I was used to communicate with podcasters because they would file a feature request or a bug report. That's why I kept maintaining Podcast Generator as a passion project for all those years. I had a user base, and although it was free, it delighted me. It made me happy to think that something I was doing was used by real people in the real world. So when Ben reached out, it was certainly standing out from others because it was a very nice short email in the 3 languages I speak. And he had a fantastic domain. One thing I didn't mention yet today is that while I was building Podcast Generator, I had thought a lot of times to move it to the cloud.
Yes.
And I explained, self-hosting in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10 would make sense because, small podcasters didn't have too many issues with bandwidth. So if they owned a hosting service, a basic one, a web hosting service, they could also host their podcast. They didn't have too many downloads. That made sense. But there was a challenge with it. If their podcast would become more popular, their hosting could block, the podcast because too much bandwidth was used, etc., etc. Plus, they were lacking like content distribution network, a CDN. A CDN is nice because you have different edges. So in the UK, you have a data center if you're downloading an episode. If you are in the UK, you download it from the data center in the UK or in Ireland maybe. And if you are in Milan, there is a data center in Milan. If you are in New York, there is a data center in that area. So downloads are faster. You also have more redundancy. If something breaks somewhere, you still download from another node. So I always thought, in the years prior to Ben's email, which was 2017, I started thinking, wow, cloud services are commoditizing. So having a bucket on S3 from Amazon Web Service and the CloudFront as a content distribution network, now it makes more sense than self-hosting. So I was already thinking and marinating that idea. So when Ben reached out, that email and that domain was really what made me think, wow, we need to speak. After the first call, I realized, when you have a good gut feeling, you don't know someone, but again, they reach out, they have an RSS reader built on a fantastic domain, which was an investment for him. This was not certainly a $10.99 domain. So it was an investment he made. So you could see it was a track record in how he cared about RSS. So I thought, if we move Podcast Generator or all the learnings we acquired over a decade or more into the cloud, this is the perfect venture which should start. And this is the perfect domain which also embeds, is also an homage, to RSS. So that's how we started. We didn't know each other, but we had a track record. He bought the domain and built a reader, and the investment per se was already showing how much he cared about the space. I had been building a free podcast hosting tool for 13 years.
Yes.
So that's also a track record. So it's kind of, you can hit the ground running when you have this context. It's not two random people that don't know each other and cannot show anything to each other. It was a call, and we immediately said, let's do it. Let's do an MVP, minimum viable product, and see what happened. And it was July. Fast forward January 2018, RSS.com podcasting. The reader was still there. So it was RSS.com/podcasting or podcast, I don't even remember, was launched as a test.
That's great. Then the interesting thing is there, because of the background that you both have, the development from then on of RSS.com and all of the things that you do and your involvement in Podcasting 2.0, which we'll get to as well, all of that is based on you're always listening to the user's needs and the podcaster's needs as to what to put out there, which, for instance, the call for geotagging in a sense, where people can tag where a podcast is from or where the podcast is based about. It's always about what is needed and necessary for discoverability of the podcaster's product.
Yeah, so there are two layers to this conversation.
Okay.
One is the past, meaning how RSS.com was launched and what was the rationale, what was the mission. And the other is today and the future, which is Podcasting 2.0.
Yeah.
You pointed out, you nailed it. You said that basically we didn't build our company, RSS.com, on what looks good on a roadmap.
Yes.
We built it on what users really need. We had indirectly conducted a user experience research with podcasters for over a decade. Just because that podcast generator was out there,
Yep.
I remember I had at least 600 between bugs, improvements, and features requests on SourceForge. Something on that ballpark. In over a decade, it makes sense. But 600 pieces of feedback on your software makes you somehow a bit of a subject matter expert in the product you're building, because you know what the actual user wants. It's not you sitting down in a cafe imagining a future roadmap and then having to validate it. So that's how RSS.com hit the ground running, without too much advertisement, a lot of organic work, paired with content. We had a blog initially already invested in content to give real value to a podcaster. They could land there. The domain authority is very nice also because we have worked a lot on providing good content. We have a team that works on that. That's RSS.com. So the first layer of this conversation was RSS.com was built not on an idea to be tested, but on an existing knowledge that was spanning over a decade with the specific niche of users you are catering to. And from there, that mission remained. We wanted to listen to the users rather than only follow our instincts. Sometimes the instincts are good. You also need to propose something new because sometimes a user doesn't know what they want until they see it. And here comes podcasting 2.0. Podcasting 2.0, I guess, it is a mix of what users really want and what we know is possible using the open RSS feed and we think the user would like. So it's a bit of a hybrid approach there. And you touched upon the location tag that we have implemented. We were one of the first hosting company implementing it. And as every other podcasting 2.0 tag, it needs to go to market first. And then we see how it is used. And also we need to make sure other hosting companies implement it. And to do so, we were very good in thinking that we couldn't do that alone. But we joined forces with other podcast hosting companies, with apps, and we meet regularly, even in person, at least a couple of times a year. We just met in London. We called this the Podcast Standards Project, and it's very much inspired to other standards consortia. For example, the World Wide Web Consortium, etc., etc. So we meet openly. We always share the outcome of the meetings in our blog. And we want to innovate in podcasting, and together this has much more impact than just in isolation.
Yes, because going on tangent here again, and I'm trying not to go on too many of them. What you mentioned there, we were speaking about before we started recording, which is how all of these companies behind podcasting, there is no competition there at all. I think it's almost because of the independent feel that there has been with podcasting from day one. I think that helps matters there, where all these different companies, yourself and all these other businesses and, True Fans and all these other companies, they're all friendly with each other and trying to make podcasting better for the user. And like I said, I believe that's because of the independent camaraderie that's built into the whole history of podcast.
I couldn't agree more. Let's call it podcast industry is made of very friendly people. And I think at the core, it's because podcasting is an open medium, is a medium with creators, and everyone talks about that. I cannot imagine a finance conference, maybe in the US, where where brokers, in different companies, they just do it the same. I could imagine them being a bit more private. Whereas in podcasting, everyone is really friendly and it's beautiful. That's what we really like of the industry. And when we work with competitors, for practically speaking, competitors like Buzzsprout, Transistor, Captivate, Blueberry, etc., etc. When we work in this podcast standards project, although we are aware we are competing on a market share, podcaster that publish in our companies, we are also running together. And I like the metaphor or the analogy of running. I always see us as athletes, in the sense that if we were running a marathon, we would run a marathon. Everyone wants to win, of course. Everyone has an ambition and an aspiration of getting in the first, rankings and spots. But at the end of the day, whatever is your position, the marathon ends and you may end up for dinner with people that competed with you, because in the end, you have the same goal, you have similar objectives, similar passions. So that's what's happening here. Everyone is friendly, and it's an industry with a lot of creators, some of which are very, creators can think out of the box. This is not a boring industry at all. So I agree. I think the nature of the podcasting industry is friendly. And so as competitors, we also collaborate openly to innovate together.
Yeah, you might have two podcasts that talk about the same subject. We do a podcast about the rock band Queen, and so do we. There is no competition there to the effect that they will guest on each other's shows quite freely and they will back each other up. Whereas with big corporates, You don't find that with many other forms of media at all, or business.
Yes. I think podcasting is a people's medium where at the base we have trust. And we have trust because it's about a voice and, video now, even a face now or more faces, a host that tells you something and you are interested in that. When you think about that, there is a concept that is called parasocial relationship. And it starts back in the 60s. It's a psychological concept. You listen to someone, I listen to you, Martin, and after a few episodes, you are a familiar voice. So I start to trust you unconsciously. I trust you like you are my friend. You don't know me. You don't even know I exist sometimes as a listener, but I know you. Maybe you mention, I don't know, your car, the model of your car. So I know the model of your car. I could meet you one day in person and say, oh, how is the Mustang doing? Did you fix it? And you would even think, how does this person know about that? But it's because of that relationship. And that relationship, from a psychological theory based on observation, was also corroborated in the past decades of science through experiments. When you listen to a familiar voice, after a while, after a bit of repetition, you produce more oxytocin. Oxytocin is a chemical, is a hormone that is informally called the bond hormone. So the mothers, when they breastfeed their children, they have a higher level of oxytocin. They produce that. So you produce oxytocin when you listen to a podcast with a familiar voice. At the same time, proximity. To become familiar, a voice that's in your ears, it's so close to you and they're basically whispering in your ear. With repetition, this creates a bigger sense of trust, right? So even the mirror neurons, these are neurons in our brain that fire upon interactions with other human beings, right? Mirror neurons fire more often with familiar voices. So if the host of a podcast is laughing, our brain laughs. If the host of a podcast is sad, our brain is sad. It's so powerful. So podcasting is peculiar because it's a bond medium based on trust.
But audio side of podcasting, with what you were saying there with emotions, that is interesting because whereas with a visual form, it's almost saying to you that this is what's happening and to be a part of it. With an audio version, and I think this is the magic of it, you feel that emotion because you are inside the conversation more, but also it allows you to respond accordingly how you feel, as opposed to being told to feel that way by another source, which you would find with television and with film, where they put like soundtrack on there to cause this emotion. And this is just natural reactionary emotion without the external force.
That's one way to see that. And I explain. I personally prefer audio. And I prefer audio because to me, the beauty of podcasting is that I can be doing something else. I can be driving. I can be working out at the gym, washing the dishes, which, by the way, I don't do very often. But just to give an example. So I can be doing anything and listening to content I love, to someone I really enjoy. Video is not a bad thing in podcasting. At RCS.com, we support HLS with Apple. We were one of the first batches of companies that support HLS. We already have onboarded selected podcasters and creators on our platform, on Apple Podcasts with HLS as well. We are going to be opening to more and more creators through a specific plan in the near future. So we have nothing against video, but I don't agree when someone says that video is the future. It's just one outlet of podcasting. And as you said, well, if I had to change it, change the conversation, shift it a bit more scientifically, right? There are more senses that compete with video. So the parasocial relationship occurs also with video. These theories from the 60s were also conceived from TV, not only radio. TV, you can have a personality, you can have someone on TV, you feel they're your friends. But with a podcast, Video works in some cases, but it's not necessarily needed every time, because once you are on video, more senses are competing, and there are some pros and cons. The pros is that if you have a nice setup and it's video first, then you can convey visuals, you could show, charts, you could do things more dynamically. But the con is that because you have so many stimuli versus just the auditory stimulus, the message could not go through as with audio only. How our brains are wired, audio is faster to be processed than video. And voice has been around since the beginning of times for humans, whereas even writing, they came so much later. And that's very important because we are really wired to immediately absorb the content of what a voice has to say. And so it's a very different circuit in our brain. I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but audio can be so powerful if well used. And that's what I love about podcasting. It's not mutually exclusive with video, but audio is really one of the main superpower of podcasting.
Absolutely. Now, the next thing we're going to has been a hot topic for a long time. I enjoyed reading your article on rss.com where you were looking at the whole thing with using artificial intelligence in the world of podcasting. And I tried to summarize it in a few words, and I put basically from spell checkers to autonomous creativity. And your article that you wrote in there starts with the spell checker use all up to where we are now in the world with autonomous creativity. Now, we both agree that there is a place for artificial intelligence in podcasting. It's a useful tool for a variety of things. But the question comes with the autonomous creativity to me personally. So, artificial intelligence in podcasting, how do you see it developing from now? And I have a little bit of news as well from this. I don't know whether you know this. Another podcast I do called When There Was Fab, we were contacted last night by the new management of Zencastr, asking us if we wanted to try a beta version out of something that they call vibecasting. And you and I both know what vibecasting is. And I'm not a particular fan of the whole idea of let's put a title in of an episode and then leave that software to create an entire series based on that, which is what vibecasting is. So very quickly, and I've gone on too long here with this introduction, what do you see as being the way we're going forward with artificial intelligence?
We have to accept that we have these new AI tools.
Yeah.
And I think we are at a peak now of usage because of the novelty. My prediction and hope is that then there's going to be a valley and we are going to use them as tool to really improve, enhance our content rather than to blindly create things that often can be perceived as slop. If we take a step back, so I didn't know about, it's a fun anecdote you're bringing up. And, Notebook LM by Google does something similar, but I can imagine in your case, they can clone your voice. Can you imagine, a pipeline where you clone your voice, you generate a script and you just, push out these random episodes or whatever episodes, and it's not really you. So you mentioned the spell checker in my article, and that was, again, another analogy. It was mid-90s, and I was in high school at the time, really, that computers, not many people were writing homeworks, basically, with computers. Not everyone, at least in rural Italy, where I was. And the teacher discovered that I had a spell checker in the computer. He didn't even know. So we had to discuss with the class and say, what are we going to do with this? Are we against? Are we pro? And it was a debate. I think it was clever because we ended up saying, you know what? As long as you are transparent, as long as we know that with a computer you have a spell checker, we think a spell checker is just a powerful vocabulary. So, you don't have to open it physically. At the time, you had a vocabulary. If you didn't know how to spell a word in Italian, my native tongue, and then, you open it, you check, you make sure the double letter, whatever accents. Yeah, so that's what happened. We said, okay, we accept it, but let's be transparent on that. So that's the whole point My argument with AI is that it's here to stay. And I'm actually excited about some outcomes. Ben and I have a US patent approved about AI for advertisement. Instead of a host reading all the ads, you clone your voice with your own consent and you just read all these variants of an ad, like "Good morning, London," "Good afternoon, Mumbai," et cetera, et cetera. You can do that programmatically with just a tool. So we're not against AI. We embrace AI. But what we are against is the lack of transparency. And that's why this conversation on the AI disclosure is so important. Disclosing doesn't have to be a punishment, but we need to be able to say, look, this was made by AI. And to do that, I even tried to propose an actionable, concrete framework, which I put on a website called should.Disclose.ai. That framework is very practical. It's 6 questions, and you have to reply yes or no, and it recommends you whether you should disclose the use of AI or not. So my point is, disclosure is paramount. Transparency is key. My framework is a proposal. Anyone can take it, change it. But the point is, when the substance of the content was made by AI, you should let the listener know.
Yep.
And the listener can decide. If I listen to a financial podcast on whatever, the SP 500, honestly, I don't care too much whether the host is an AI voice or a weather podcast on my region. It's fine. But if I listen to your podcast and I know you, if you start to make up these new episodes with your cloned voice, which, by the way, the technology makes it getting better and better. So soon it's indistinguishable. Soon it's going to be like that. So the problem is that you are breaching the trust I have in the host, in you. And when you do that, there's no easy comeback. And people that listen to a show because they feel this parasocial relationship with the host, they need to know there is a lived life behind the voice. They need to know whether there is or not. Then they choose. So it's very important. It's certainly a hype moment now, and disclosure is key. Judgment comes later. I also think many people will stop. It's a novelty now, because there is also a craft in creating content which is valuable, rather than spitting out thousands of episodes a day, some of which have inconsistencies, some of which can be dangerous if you give a health advice to someone and it's just randomly generated by AI. You could have really, really dangerous things that happen there. Someone could take it the wrong way. Like, you have to be very cautious. So hopefully, to your initial questions, which again I took, and then I went back to transparency and disclosure, AI is here to stay. AI should be a tool to improve the content, and it shouldn't make the substance of the content. And if it does, if it is a podcast generated by AI automatically, it's fine. Maybe it's a weather forecast podcast, whatever. But you need to disclose.
Yeah, quickly before we get to listener questions, that reminds me of a discussion I had with John McDermott of Calaroga Shark Media. Actually, I think you were there as well when we did the live recording of Pod News Weekly Review, and John McDermott was mentioning that with Calaroga Shark, he's created a weather bot, basically, that does a weather program. And he said that to him, that isn't a problem, because he's saying that is just information for information's sake.
Yes.
It's something that, a person could read or whatever, but it doesn't matter that it's a person that reads it or not. But he said that in other circumstances, there are shows like talk shows that need to have that humanity in them in a way, creatively, to get over what the discussion is about. That is the way to look at it. And you hinted at something there where we were both in that talk towards the end of the podcast show, which was about AI, with everybody's favourite person of the year, Janine Wright from Inception Point AI, where Dan, who is a medical professional, does a podcast about medical work. And he brought out to her that they've got a podcast that puts across that this person who is an AI, and none of it has any human interaction. And he was saying it's full of inconsistencies, some dangerous suggestions for people as well. And this AI is saying that they were a doctor. That is the wrong side of AI, really.
Yes, because a true crime AI generated podcast with an inconsistent narrative arc, that's annoying.
Yep,
But a health podcast with non scientific suggestions and recommendation, it's dangerous.
it is.
That's the whole point.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's very offensive. I think Inception Point AI removed doctors now.
Have they? Okay.
I think so. I think I read something, and again, I haven't judged openly. I get the business model. I'm concerned that the human creators are penalized by the algorithms, because if you have 3,000 episodes a day or hundreds of new podcasts a week, which are also low quality on average, but if you have them, they compete with humans, and that's why I want the disclosure. Just disclose it's AI. Yeah, but it's not the business model per se. I get where they come from, but really it can be dangerous, and nobody can really objectively say that's not the case.
No, they cannot. So I've had a lot of questions in for you, as we knew that we would. And the first one of which is Cam from Jacked Up Review Show said to ask you, how do you think the technological side of podcasting is advancing when compared to industries such as the advances in engineering?
I think that in the first place, podcasting 2.0 tags open new opportunities whilst leveraging the open RSS feed, which was a conversation we had for years. Can you innovate in the open RSS feed, or you need walled gardens? You can innovate in the RSS feed. One example you made before, location tag. I can geolocate an episode or even an entire show. And imagine the outcomes if an application or a directory can surface podcasts that were recorded near you, or they talk about a place you want to visit. So this is exciting. And then there are real world applications like PodRoll is cross recommendations across podcasts. And the initial PodRoll data that has been released by Podcast Index, which is the whole organization beyond Podcasting 2.0, with that data, I built a couple of weeks ago an atlas where you can visually see for any podcast that's recommended or is recommending, you can click on it like a network, like a universe. You see these bubbles and you see who recommends it, who is recommended, and you can click on all of them dynamically and interact. So it's nice, and it's at atlas.rss.io. It's our lab, rss.io. And that atlas just shows you pragmatically, in a tangible way, how you can innovate in podcasting. These are recommendations from humans, by humans. And once they stop being a data set, just in text format or in a database, but they become a visual constellations of podcasts that you can click on and move, etc., etc. That's where is you can see innovation and how compelling it is. So yeah, podcasting is innovating. It's not only a claim. It's like it's backed by real projects, and they can be seen and touched and explored. And yeah, in HLS per se as well, video podcast in HLS, which makes possible also reducing bandwidth, adapting to the speed of a mobile device. This is innovation per se, and it's fully compatible with the open RSS feed. So that's where we are going. We are certainly innovating, especially after a few years in the middle, where there was not much going on. So this is the exciting time for podcasting.
Absolutely. Gil from the Mindbuzz Podcast said, the barrier to creating content has never been lower, but attention has never been harder to earn. In your opinion, what separates a podcast that will stand the test of time and still be around in 10 years from the ones that disappear?
It's a great question. I have an opinion because we thought a lot about it at rss.com. And there are two, if we had to oversimplify, right? There is a spectrum. A podcaster can fit into a spectrum. You cannot really put someone in a bucket or another bucket. But you can have a show that becomes extremely popular. So it's great. it starts to gain, it has production or not. It starts organically, but it becomes very popular. Okay, but that's one bucket. It's the bucket probably every creator dreams, like, okay, my podcast becomes the next Joe Rogan, just to give an example. Okay, that's one bucket. But then I think that the possibility of being long lasting and have a trustworthy audience is catering to a niche, to a specific group of people, which is not too broad. On rss.com, we even launched a plan which is completely free. So it's at a loss for us. It has all the basic features. So you can have as many episodes as you want. We don't delete them after a while. We don't limit them. We hope you eventually grow enough to buy a plan so you have more features, premium features, but you can still use the free plan. And it's called Free Local and Niche, FLAN for the friends. And the reason is that we want to foster this local and niche podcast. So you start and you target a community, which can be a local community in your hometown. It can be the Linux community, the open source community. It can be anything you want to be. But the more niche and the more, selected is your target addressable market, the higher the chance that your listeners are going to be long-lasting, are going to be there for you, rather than something very generic that doesn't really resonate with everyone specifically. So a niche podcast, and the niche can be as big as you want, again, hometown or a big community. But niche is the key to have more chances to last longer and gain an audience that follows you and doesn't just drop after a couple of episodes.
I was speaking with somebody who does a podcast called There's a Place, and their show is particularly niche about buildings and premises from the history of the Beatles. And I think that's really niche.
Yes.
That's got a long-lasting ability in it, in my mind, because nothing else will go to that sort of level of magnification, for want of a better word.
Yes, and that podcast has also higher chances of ending up in a Netflix documentary about the Beatles, in a book about the Beatles, because it's very specific. So it can be also found in a very close setting. You're looking for something specific, you find it. If someone has a generic podcast and has one episode about the places of the Beatles, it's going to dilute. It's not going to be found more, as easily. So that's the point. So not only the audience is going to be there, but also you have more opportunities to end up being popular for the specific topic you're talking about.
Absolutely. Phil Better from the podcast Mogul's Playbook asked, what do you foresee being the changes in the marketing of podcasts?
Well, I guess, so for me, the changing, so there is advertisement that's always there. I've seen experiments from other companies as well, where there are automatic advertisements of a show in another show. There is even a technique called feed drop, where you have an RSS feed and you drop an episode from someone else. So everyone who's following you as a listener downloads that episode, and that's a discoverability tool. I'm not a big fan of that, because it could betray the trust. I'm listening to you. I don't want to listen to someone else. I'm following your show. I think it would not work with me. So for me, the best way is human collaboration, being guests of each other, as you said before. So for me, the key is not really the advertisement at scale, right? But it's really human to human recommendation. You invite someone or you recommend a podcast from someone else. This works very well. Notice that Apple Podcasts now, if from the transcript they detect you're recommending another show on Apple Podcast, they put the link automatically in the description. This is beautiful. I think this is one of the most effective, unless you are a huge production and then you can afford, I don't know, multi-million dollars campaigns on billboards in Times Squares.
I've built this podcast originally around exactly that, because my podcast, when it started, was basically I bring in other people from other shows to talk about their shows and do almost a mini version of their show to introduce people so that people can discover and hopefully go and listen to their show. I built the whole thing around that. So it works.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it works. And you kept the human side. You didn't drop an episode with no context, you know. You had an interview format that's basically cross-pollination. Cross-pollination between humans, I think, is the key, especially at a smaller scale. And most podcasters are on the smaller scale. We have the data. We had like tens of thousands of podcasts, hundreds of thousands over the year passing through our lenses because they used our company. And yeah, those that have 20,000 downloads, let alone 100,000 or million, there are very few. Most of the others are really competing or enjoying podcasting with a smaller audience, and they're growing little by little.
The final question I've got from a listener is from Stephen Nicholson of Sheer Pod Attack. And he said, what do you think is the next shift in podcast discovery? And to him, because he's a music podcast, how do you think niche music podcasts can position themselves for that next shift?
The next shift in podcast discovery, we touched upon it just before, to me, is human recommendations. And outlast.RSS.io is it's a free project, open source, that it shows how powerful this can be. And those recommendations can happen during an episode, but also, again, podcasting 2.0 PodRoll feature, it's what allows to have this recommendation travel in the RSS feed. So this is very powerful. To me, that's the key. And talking of music, I think music is a bit trickier. I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't know how to give a happy answer yet. Because my only observation of the music space globally, coming from a global perspective, meaning I live in Spain, you are living in the UK, our company is operating in the US, so we have most US people. The problem is licensing.
Yes.
That's the thing. A radio has a certain, radius, actually, where the antennas can transmit. But a podcast with music, it's so hard to find a universal licensing system. And I've seen initiatives. So I'm not saying this is happening. So the problem with music is that because it's categorized as music, well, it depends on how the format is. But if it's a lot of music in a show, it wouldn't work in Spotify podcasts. They would literally kick you out and tell you are an artist. You should be on the music end of our platform. The shift must occur in terms of licensing. There should be a universal licensing where you pay whatever, $100 a year or whatever it is, £500, £50 a month, £5 a month, whatever, dollars, pounds, as long as then you can podcast that music. And then there's going to be a way for organizations in different jurisdictions to collect the money. It's very hard, actually, to make it happen. But that's what I think should be an important milestone for music in podcasting.
I used to be in bands and I'm a songwriter, and I went to the talk about music in podcasting that was at the podcast show. And like you said, the basic answer is that each region in the world has a different law for the use of music. You can't, at the moment, have a blanket all over the world licensing at present. That is the issue that there is there. But it's a problem that's not going to go away very quickly either.
Yeah, I guess it could be tackled step by step. For example, think about Europe and the UK and the US. If only we could start these conversations among agencies in those territories, right? That would be a nice start. I know Spain and Italy have this authority, let's say, for musicians, right? And it would be a matter of going, having a conversation. It would take a long time.
Yep.
So that could be a start. Then having it working globally, it would be a big challenge. I also wonder if all the countries really have such an important organization dealing with the music rights. I bet they do. That's my lack of knowledge. But maybe we could have at least some start in some territories where we are, where we operate most, and from there see where it goes. But again, it's a huge challenge. In fact, I would never want to undertake it because it's not my, it's not where I don't think it would be the best use of my time because I don't have skills and preparations there. But I wish something is going to happen, even if it starts with UK and Spain, and then you add Italy, then you add France, then Germany, and then US. Okay, so there is a common, let's say, bucket of money or pot, call it, and you can take it from there. You have to measure, of course, how it downloads and locations, but it's feasible technically on a high level.
Yeah.
One anecdote here. I was talking with someone a couple of months ago. How does the post service work globally? The post service. Not many people now send physical postcards. But again, I don't know, if you are in the UK and you send a letter, physical letter to New York or a postcard from London to New York, you pay the British Post Service and it goes to USPS. Who pays who? And I didn't know. So we started to search and we found there are a lot of Reddit threads with these. Apparently, this is not something, it's a common question. And it turns out that all these, post agencies all over the world, they keep track on an Excel or huge, very simple database. And they meet once a year. That's according to what I read on Reddit. So again, to be verified. So they meet once a year and they basically say, okay, you owe this to me, I owe this to you. And they exchange basically the money they owe to each other. Why can't we do something like that with music if it happens with letters and postcards?
Yes, absolutely. I do this thing where I still have a 4-track tape recorder that I use and have used to record music on for 40 years, definitely. And there's this movement that we've got where one of us will record one thing. So I might record a drum pattern on one of the tracks, one of the 4, or a guitar or something. And then I post it in the normal post on a cassette to somebody in America, in Japan, in Australia, or wherever. So I'm very well versed in the sending of these things to people.
Wow.
One of my suggestions would be for the music situation, and a simple way around it, but nothing is ever simple with this sort of thing. I think that if somebody could make it that you have a group, distributors, for instance, who watch how shows go, where they go into different territories and things, and take note of that. If there was a department available that was keeping track of this, and you made the music a part of it so you could actually have music in there or music clips, then there's the potential there for maybe having the resource to discuss with those local areas like the PRS in the UK who control music rights, and you've got ASCAP in America and all of these things. That's a possibility where you would have then that company who distribute would have that list to be able to contact and say, oh, these shows, they've gone into your region. We will pay you this much for it being there and you this much for being in this territory. That's an easy workaround, but I say easy, but nothing is ever that easy. Just a suggestion off the top of my head.
Yeah, it could also be based on self-assessment in the sense that some podcasters, like there will always be people that don't comply either out of lack of knowledge or because they don't feel like at their scale. So similar to software in the 90s, maybe people were pirating Windows, many people, not the corporate one, but I can imagine many people having their pirated copy because they didn't pay. There was one pair. Microsoft was not really looking in the single homes to see, in the end, they closed an eye, etc., etc. But the point is, same with music. there will be people that want to put music out there and they don't care about licenses. And if they get caught, they take the consequences, which can be removal, can be a fine. But there's going to be a lot of podcasters that just want to do it right, but they don't have the tools. For those podcasters, an organization where you can literally download a report from your hosting company, for example, where you know for each episode which music you played for how long. That's easy. You can do it. We can build something like that for RSS.com. And in which territory those episodes were downloaded. Then with that report, there would be an automatic calculation of of what to pay. And instead of paying on demand, which you never know what's the cap, maybe you pay $100 a month, just to say a random number, and they take care of distributing at your scale the money to the various entities. So why it's like, taxes. When I do my own taxes, you do your own taxes. You can have a tax accountant, but you have to tell them or declare also. You have some things which are if you open an account in a stock exchange, you have to download the information and documentation, send it to your accountant, to take care of it. So it's based on trust as well, right? On self-declaring. So why can't we do that? I download. So if I want to do to the best of my knowledge, do the best I can, I pay a license, generic, to a company which also sustains that company, and then every month or every year, I download all my episodes, the geolocation from where they were downloaded, IAB compliant. So there is a standard there. It's not random numbers. And based on the music that was in each episode, they just take my $100 per month and they share it to the agencies. That's doable today. It's actually a good business model. If someone wanted to start this, I think it would work.
So do I. If you get the time, what sort of podcast do you like to listen to?
So most of the podcasts I listen to now are industry podcasts. I listen to Pod News Weekly Review, Podcasting 2.0 religiously, and the New Media Show. Then in my spare time, the podcast I've been listening to consistently, not just, as an exploration, is Acquired. I like it very much. The hosts are great. I mean, now they do that full time, and it's fantastic. The production, the research that goes into telling those stories. And what I like of Acquired is that in the early days, it was really about tech companies, but now it's branched out, and there is an episode on F1, Formula One. There is an episode on Hermes, the Hermes, the luxury bags that cost like 10,000 pounds and plus. And it was a saddle maker, like for horses. And I mean, I love, because I find it very inspiring. That's the main podcast I listen to, which is not an industry podcast. And then every day, if I have a moment or if I'm driving, then I sometimes try to listen to something new. Podbees by Norma Jean. It's again an industry podcast, but I like it. I like it very much. And yeah, so for the moment, industry podcast and Acquired is an evergreen for me. Like when I'm I have a long drive, 3 hours episodes, it's my delight.
That's fantastic. How can people get in touch with you?
Alberto@rss.com.
Simple and effective. Yeah.
It's simple, and that's the easiest way. Yeah, and happy to talk. If we meet at any industry event, that's even easier, right? So when you get an email, sometimes it's an easy answer. Sometimes it takes time, so you postpone it. It takes a few days. Whereas if you find someone in our industry in general at an industry event, that's much easier because you just stop. Maybe you're having a coffee, you stop there. And I think it's that this human-to-human interaction, face-to-face interaction, is very powerful, which is what happened to us, right? The Castle Inn.
It did. Thank you for speaking with me today, Alberto. This was fun.
It was great. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Pods Like Us is available anywhere that podcasts can be found, and all of the links to the social media and email are available on the opening page of themarvzone.org. The show is distributed and sponsored by RSS.com, and we thank them for their support. Please rate and review the show on the platform that you are listening or viewing the episode on. All feedback is gratefully received, as it helps to know if there is anything that needs to be looked at. Thank you for listening, and I hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.